This is what I did a little bit of research on, really. So evaluating a strategy that empowers every church to imagine itself church planting. So in the blurb that you got, that big pack of 30 odd pages, this is just to remind you what I wrote in that. So it's a Baptist Union of Great Britain context. So we're Baptist congregational churches. There's about 1,800, maybe 2,000 of those kind of traditional churches in the UK, Charity Commission recognised churches. And what would it mean to initiate really effective church planting in there? And the gnarly question I had, was, we have about 3% of our churches church planting, and they're actually doing it very well. The ones that do it very well. But actually 3% of our churches church planting well is a terrible strategy for reaching the UK. What we need is 80% of our churches church planting adequately. Like, we want 3 doing it brilliantly, 3%, and 80% doing it absolutely brilliantly. So actually, what are the barriers? What's the problem? And how do we overcome those problems and get to a point where 80% of our churches could at least imagine that church planting, starting a new Christian community, was something that we could do because new people were becoming Christians. So that was a key part of my research. This is driven to catalyze new people becoming Christians, or because new people are becoming Christians. And that's why we're initiating churches, very similar, I think, to the 3 steps that Maria talked about. I talk about gospel, discipleship, and church, different language, but exactly the same 3 steps of what we're doing. So that was a gnarly question. I did a bit of research, which I'll talk us through. And then I also want to just finish with 1 minute at the end to say, has it actually worked? Like, have the embryonic attempts to now apply this research into a real life context of a regional association of about 150 churches, are we actually seeing more churches able to church plant because of the outworkings of the research? Does that make sense? So that's the arc I'm trying to take us on right the way through. Just so you know who I am, because all of our research comes through the lens of our personality. So I am happy to be identified as an evangelist and something of a serial church planter. I now fill 2 main roles. One, I'm a regional minister within the Yorkshire Baptist Association, but focused on church planting and pioneering specifically. And secondly, I'm a director at the St Hills Centre for Church Planting, which is a training space. And I deliberately sought to fill those 2 spaces to try and go, actually, there's the hands-on affecting churches in the regional minister role, and there's the hands-on training leaders, and how actually can we bring those 2 things together in the piece of research. And Asbury was the institute that held the thesis and the doctorate work that did the research. That was the clever title I came up with. I was quite pleased with the little Beatles reference, you know, and you can find it online if you're interested. And this is what I did. So I took 30 of our very ordinary church leadership team. So genuine cross-section of the kind of churches you would find. Didn't pick any of the 3% that were church planting. So most of these had never church planted in living memory or in historical memory. And I took 30 of those leadership teams through a 9-month guided conversation. So it's 9 months long, and it was quite a complex and full thing with a number of key elements, which we talked about: scripture, stories, and strategy. So we looked at some scripture, we looked at some stories of churches doing it, and we looked at strategies or models of how they might did it in conversation. Did some pre and post tests around that to assess confidence and sense of certainty about whether they could church plant or not, like where were they in terms of being, what had moved. And then did 34 in-depth semi-structured interviews to kind of say what aspects of this experience most helped you move from where you were, relatively low level of confidence around church planting, to where you are, a relatively high level, because we did see that transition happen. So what aspects of this experience were most influential to shift the dial from a low level of confidence that you could church plant to a higher level of confidence that you could church plant? And then I drew in 25 experts, including a regional minister from every single one of our other associations and a number of others, to kind of get their additional kind of thing. What I found was 5 findings. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through the 5 findings, and then I'm going to go back through them and just articulate some of the things we then implemented off the back of them. Does that make sense? So number 1, we found that confident, ordinary, everyday and everyone evangelism needs to be normalized in our local churches. So there was an incredibly low level of confidence and experience of sharing faith, both in leaders of churches, ministers and lay leaders, and also in church members. So 70% of the ministers I interviewed had not led someone new to faith personally in the 5 years previous. 70% had not seen someone they personally knew come to faith in the 5 years before that. 40% of ministers had not seen someone come to faith personally or professionally, i.e. out of their own personal network as a human being or through their role leading a church. 40% had not seen someone come to faith in the 5 years previously. And in essence, it was even worse amongst church members. And lots of them reported it was because they didn't know anyone in a meaningful way who wasn't a Christian, or they didn't feel confident to explain the gospel in a way that person would understand. I also discovered that 8 years on average is how long it took someone from their baptism as an adult, if that is a marker of their coming to faith, 8 years from their baptism as an adult to no longer having a meaningful relationship with someone who wasn't a Christian outside of their family. So it takes 8 years for a new Christian being drawn into our churches to get to a point where they don't have a meaningful relationship outside of family members with someone who's not a Christian. So the first finding was actually this ability, it's almost pre-planting work. This ability to share faith was incredibly low because people didn't know non-Christians and people didn't know how to explain the gospel in a way that their non-Christians would know. So there's a relational piece and an explanational piece. Second finding was there was real limited awareness of diverse church planting models. So the overwhelming sense was church planting was you need a large group of people and a large budget, and you start with church. Again, it overlaps a lot with what Maria was saying, that collapsing of the 3 steps until you get to the point you have to start with church. So all these ordinary church leadership teams across the board, their understanding of church planting was you needed a significant group of people that you moved from point A to point B, and they immediately started to do something that resembled a traditional shape of church with a building, with a paid minister who was trained and accredited, and with all the kind of bells and whistles, sometimes literally, that came with that. And they couldn't imagine an alternative, and therefore most of them would say that is simply beyond our capacity. We can't do that. So they hugely benefited from hearing about different models and styles, microchurch, disciple-making movements, cafe church, that breadth of understanding of church. Obviously, theologically and ecclesiology, in a Baptist context, there's no anxiety about the priest or the parish or the building or the Eucharist, so all of that wasn't needing to be challenged, but they needed to see the models of it. Fourth finding, did I just skip one? No. Third finding I did. Leaders benefited from coaching by people who are actually doing it much more than post-practitioners or theorists. And that became even more significant if the person doing the training resembled them socially, ethically, or economically. So what I mean by that is, if you have a professional person come and deliver the training experience was lots better, but the number of churches that came from it was lots lower. If you had someone deliver the training who was just like the people who were receiving it, the training experience was poorer, but the number of churches that initiated was greater. I.e., if you had a group of vocationally minded people, mechanics, plumbers, and electricians, and I, with my PhD, doctor, came in and did the training experience and content would be really good, but the number of churches started would be really low. If you had another mechanic who was a few years into starting a microchurch in their home, deliver the training experience registered poorly on scoring, but the number of churches 6 months later that initiated was 4 times greater. So there was something about what I came to call just like me training, trained by someone who is just like me, has a greater output of churches, even if the actual experience of the training is of a poorer quality. Which has raised a question in my head about what do we assess? We give out our feedback forms at the end of a training session and judge the training on the training experience. We don't assess it on 6 months later, the actual outcome of the training experience. Yeah. Number 4, people from Black and brown majority experiences, irrespective of their own ethnicity, showed significantly more confidence in sharing faith and starting churches. And that became contagious if they were invited onto leadership. So it took about 4 months for a leadership team's confidence in church planting and faith sharing to go up by 2 points. Took about 6 months if there was someone from a majority black or brown experience, irrespective actually of that person's own personal ethnicity, but their church experience was coming from a black or brown community. And the last finding was the biggest motivator actually to move forward with planting a church was that you personally knew someone who was doing it as well, by far. You had someone that you would describe as a friend or a family member. They were doing it. That by far was the biggest motivator to move over and above good training, over and above funding, over and above a professional there to support or a coach in place. By far the biggest thing is I have a personal relationship with someone who's doing it out there. So there were the five findings. Sorry. What I want to do, because I want to do the arc that goes from a piece of credible research that then doesn't stay dusty in the library, but becomes dusty on the ground. Does that make sense? And arches across and say, so how have we tried to implement this, both as a regional association, so from the position of being a regional minister, 150, 120 churches of an established type, and also in the training space of St Hills. How have we tried to pull it across and actually put it into practice? So here's just examples of some of the things we've done. So implication number one, they basically, finding number one and implication number one relate together. Number two, 2, 3, 3. Does that make sense as they run down? So the first one, if you remember, was what I've called evangelism. I know we won't all have comfort with that word, but you understand what I mean here in terms of faith sharing and inviting people to know Jesus. So too busy and too complicated is what we've discovered. Now, thinning out people's busy lives so they can have relationships is beyond the scope of what we can do, but too complicated we can address. So as an association, we've begun engaging directly with members in churches. That's a new thing, bypassing the minister and directly working with churches. The project's called Inspire. It's really simple ways that you get to share your faith with very simple tools around festival times. So last year around festival times, we think it created about 120,000 faith sharing conversations of ordinary people to ordinary people. We did it with a candy cane, the story of the candy cane. Does that make sense? So simple ways that ordinary people can share faith. Implication number two was about the different models of church. So what we've realized is we need to simplify our definition of church, but multiply our ways of doing church. So what you need to do is much simpler, but the ways you can do it is much more diverse. And that leads to multiplication, doesn't it? So some things we've done there is we've invested very significantly in a disciple-making movement called Big Life, working across our churches to help ordinary people start ordinary churches in their homes and in the places where they meet. We've leaned into training of anointed amateurs, would be the language that we use more and more, and trying to put the anointed amateur as the primary church planter, not the paid professional. So actually say you don't need a paid professional to start a church, because immediately if you do that, you need a certain congregation size for finances. So the anointed amateur takes the lead and the paid professional moves into the back room, out the way. We've done a measurement piece. So what you count is what you count, i.e. what you count is what you value. And so if you can change what you count, it changes what you value. So in our Baptist family, we count how many people come on a Sunday, how many church members do you have, what's your budget? That all lends to saying we value big expressions of church. So now we've said actually what we count is how many churches have you started in a home, how many times have you multiplied to a different home, and create like a variable standard of what you count, you know, to try and do that measurement piece. Implication number 4 is around leadership and kind of recognizing actually you need if your leaders are not able to share faith and do evangelism, then your members are almost certainly not going to do that as well. So intentionally overemphasizing the evangelist gifting and the church planting skill set. So for example, in our Baptist world, we have ministers in training, equivalent to Anglican ordinands. We have newly accredited ministers, NAMs, equivalent to Anglican curates. And then we have continued ministerial development, which is your ongoing thing. Within our association, we've now said it's compulsory that the primary training you receive at all those levels is in evangelism and church planting. So irrespective as a minister in training, whether you're coming into training as a chaplain or a youth specialist or be a pastor, doesn't matter, you will receive church planting training. And NAM training, newly accredited minister, you will receive church planting training. It's not a choice, it's not something a few get to pick, it's what everyone gets trained in. And we're working on a project that continual ministerial training will have to have that church planting kind of space in there. Number 4 is we are a racist institute. And I say that sadly and confidently. Like the 27 most senior positions in the Baptist world, as in the 27 most senior ones, are all filled by white people. So every single regional team leader, equivalent of a bishop, every single one of our national team leaders, specialist team leaders, every single one of our college principals are white. So we are an institutionally racist organization. There are justice and equality drivers that are more than sufficient to address that. But what I found is there's missional drivers. That people from black and brown communities are significantly more confident in sharing faith and planting churches. And when they move into leadership, that becomes contagious. Like it's caught by everyone. So actually, how do we address that? So one of the things we've done strategically is if you receive grant funding from the Yorkshire Baptist Association, there's a package now. You don't just get the money, you get a package of support, and you have to enter a 2-year learning community on interethnic church and how you raise up leaders from ethnic minorities. It's a requirement to receive the money, is that you have to do that piece of work. And then lastly, implication on training. So we're moving everything away from what in layman's term you might call just in case training. So just in case training is we take you away for 3 years right at the beginning of your career, and we'll train you in everything we can possibly think, just in case you might need it in the next 30 years, which is our traditional model of training, and moved it to just in time and just like me training. So just in time is I have a situation right in front of me, train me now how to deal with it. It's just in time, and it's delivered by just like me people. Ethnically, socially, economically, it's just like me. Last slide, last minute, is has it worked? So what I've tried to do is talk you through the gnarly question of it's a rubbish strategy that 3% of churches can plant brilliantly. How do we get to 80% of churches planting adequately? What are the barriers? How do we move that across? That's a gnarly question. Talked you through the 5 research findings, talked you through the attempt to implement them as strategic things. Has it worked? My 3 answers are yes, not sure, not yet. So in the Yorkshire Baptist Association, we have planted more churches in the last 4 years than the 47 years prior to that. And for the first time in 100 years, have got past the 1-for-1 ratio, i.e. we now start more new churches than we close. And it's been 100 years since that's been a reality. And I'm talking about traditional charity commissions, Sunday morning churches. We've also got an array of kind of disciple-making, micro-churchy kind of things going on. We're still struggling to count them properly. Do you know what I mean? So part of me is confident to say yes. However, also not sure, because it's not tried and tested. Does that make sense? And there were some other things that also have happened in that 4-year period. Maybe they were bigger triggers. So there's that cautious. And then my not yet, my definite you not yet, is we have tried to roll this out nationally. About 18 months into that, and we've just been caught in the long reads of politics and practicalities on that. So we launched a project called Everyone Everywhere, which was trying to scale it up. I'd have said that's had minimal traction because of not being able to navigate some of the politics that inevitably exists in an institute. So there's my thoughts.